Thank you very much, Dr. Mutuma. I am still struggling with technology, so you have to bear with me. It's the new world. I think the trouble of being the last, one of the last speakers is that you may end up not having anything to speak about. But so I'll just make a few, I think, strategic points on areas where I see gaps in the comments made by some of my colleagues. I think what we had this afternoon is basically a lot of discussions on the nuances and the details of Islamist ideologies in Eastern Africa. We haven't seen, or we haven't had, I think, a lot about Al-Shabaab's own ideological evolution. And I think that's where I want to highlight a few points. Al-Shabaab came to the fore around 2006, that is, and progressively, I think, began the path towards militancy and radicalization. But one crucial, I think, element in Al-Shabaab's, one seminal, I think, event in Al-Shabaab's ideological evolution was the intervention by the Ethiopian forces. And that clearly radicalized the movement much more than it was before. So in that period of over 10 years, Al-Shabaab was basically on an escalator of radicalization. And I think that is critical to understand, that every setback and every point at which Al-Shabaab was under pressure, it basically became more militant and more hardline. And this is quite fascinating because if you look at historical context or other contexts, you will see that when insurgencies are under serious pressure, they soften, they become pragmatic, they begin to engage and begin dialogue. This we haven't seen in Al-Shabaab, and it is a unique feature, I think, of Islamist insurgencies. The other point is, which I want to highlight also about Al-Shabaab's ideology, is the fact that initially it started like any other organization with very puritanical version of Salafi Islam. And most of the Al-Shabaab top commanders had actually trained in Afghanistan. And so they were politically radicalized. They were anti-American, anti-Western, and that created what you may call Al-Shabaab's own homemade ideology, which was a worldview around, a worldview which was characterized by not only just anti-Westernism, but very conspiratorial. The notion that there is big conspiracy to destroy Islam and so on and so forth. During the time of Godani, we saw Al-Shabaab actually become much more centralized. And this is quite important because the centralization was crucial, was also ideological. Al-Shabaab did not just control itself through its own structural, through its own organizational pillars, but also it wanted to centralize the way in which the jihadi narrative was being disseminated. And so we began to see a much more concerted effort to disseminate a single line, a single message by the Al-Shabaab leadership. And remember, this was a time when there was also a tug of war division within Al-Shabaab. After the death of Godane, who was killed in a US drone strike, we saw the movement quickly come together and appoint a leadership. And that tells you a great deal about Al-Shabaab. That despite the fact that it has been under a lot of pressure over a decade, is a very well organized bureaucracy, which has a way of basically leadership transition, which is actually very smooth. So we saw Abu Ubaidah take over from Godane. Abu Ubaidah continued on the same path, escalated attacks, actually cross-border attacks, and that's when we saw the deadly attacks in Garissa and Westgate. This was under the leadership of Abu Ubaidah. So in many ways, Al-Shabaab has become even much more militant, much more hardline. And one other interesting factor is that we began to see increased attack on civilian targets. And this is quite significant to understand because in the past, there was this debate within Al-Shabaab movement of how should we go about conducting attacks? Is it permissible in Islam to kill civilians? What if civilians are caught in crossfire? How do we explain this? So there was this ideological debates going on within Al-Shabaab. And interestingly, Al-Shabaab carried out one of the most biggest attacks in Somali history in 2017, October. And this massive bomb which targeted a road junction killed over 500 civilians. This has never happened anywhere in Africa. A truck bomb exploded in the midst of a junction, killing hundreds of civilians and wounding actually over 2,000 civilians. And the impact is still visible today. How can a movement justify that kind of an attack or explain it? And interestingly, Al-Shabaab's view is that this probably was not a bomb intended for this target, but in any case, if a Muslim dies in an attack which is justified, which is part of the jihad, that person goes straight to heaven. And this is a very interesting concept within even Islam. Is a hot topic which is discussed. It's called shahada, which is martyrdom. Who are the martyrs? You know, people who have been displaced or dislocated from their homes unjustly. Now, Al-Shabaab has added another category, which is civilians who are killed in the crossfire of a just jihad, as they see it. And I think that's quite significant. It explains why there is this big threshold for civilian casualties in not only Somalia, but we see this in Mali Sahel, in the Sahel region. We see in North Africa, we see it elsewhere. This ideology, this now marks a transition from not just Salafi jihadism, but also a much more virulent strain of Salafi doctrine, which is, I will come to, it's called takfiri, which is anybody who does not subscribe to the view of the movement, or the movement, in this case, Al-Shabaab, is basically out of the pale of Islam. And this is completely radical. There are only very few historical antecedents, you know, and this is in ancient history, we will find groups that have emerged under certain caliphates who are attacking actually people with swords in mosques, and they were like the Khawarij, for example. So this marks also another elevation of Al-Shabaab's ideology from not just simple Salafism, but now to a much more hardline, hardcore Salafi takfirism. And this is quite important to understand. Another, I think, concept, another element which I think Dr. Rutere had intended or had discussed, I think initially, was the future of Al-Shabaab and the future of these jihadi movements. Where are these movements headed? And I haven't had, I think, much from the discussions. So I'll just make a couple of quick points. Number one, there is a big debate among academics on the so-called lifespan of insurgencies, the lifespan of militant groups. And one particular group of academics in Oxford actually came up with an interesting hypothesis, which said that the average lifespan of an insurgency is 10 years. I can't remember exactly the names of the academics, but I remember that was their conclusion, that they have done they have collected data from every part of the globe, and they came to the conclusion that you need, you know, after 10 years, movements either disintegrate, decline, or basically just dissolve. In the case of, so just using that simple yardstick. I think it is clear that Al-Shabaab has gone beyond that average lifespan. It's now close to 12 years of its existence. It has proved itself to be much more resilient, much more adaptable than anybody had thought. The last 2 years, it has been under relentless drone strikes, which have decapitated or completely killed its top leadership. Nearly 60% of it is gone. So the ideological core of Al-Shabaab, 60% of it is gone. How does that impact the organizational structure, but also its ideological direction and future? And one interesting element which we're beginning to see, and which one of my colleagues mentioned, I can't remember who exactly, but he mentioned the issue of how insurgencies progressively become criminal. You know, remember, there is a criminal element in every armed insurrection, armed movement. This is everywhere. If you look at the history of every organization, there is a component, a tiny component, which is motivated by criminal desire and not by ideological commitment. Now, if you look at Al-Shabaab from that prism, then you will come to see that a shrinking ideological core, an expanding criminal layer, outer layer, creates its own set of challenges. We are beginning to see Al-Shabaab, for example, conduct predatory taxation. You know, they are coming to farmers and they are basically telling them, you need to pay this and that, or we will shut you down. They are collecting, they are basically conducting kidnap for ransom. One of the Italian abductees was released recently, and we know that millions of dollars were paid to Al-Shabaab. So Al-Shabaab is now involved in kidnap for ransom, predatory taxation. We also know it had links with smuggling businesses, especially sugar and charcoal and so on and so forth. So this poses a number of, I think, policy challenges. Is an Al-Shabaab that is becoming criminal much more of a threat than Al-Shabaab that was ideologically Salafist or jihadist? This is an area which I have no answer, but I think that probably we are celebrating too early if we say that Al-Shabaab is no longer a militant jihadi threat, it's now a criminal syndicate. So we can negotiate with them, we can do anything. If you look at and you know, I don't want to draw a lot of analogy, but if you look at South America, you see a similar pattern in which you have very powerful narco traffickers who have become very powerful. They almost own the state. It becomes extremely difficult then to extricate them from the state. And we are beginning to see those kind of patterns emerging in places in Somalia. Take the example of Mogadishu, for example. Mogadishu is a big city of a million population, and Al-Shabaab still has a lot of influence in the city. The government does not fully control Mogadishu. The government, actually, Al-Shabaab out-taxes the government in Mogadishu. It's able to go and, tell business people, you need to pay this and that. And they are very well organized. They are very well organized. They have systems which is now electronic. So that tells me one thing, which is this is no longer an insurgency. This is a shadow state. This is a shadow state. And so, I don't want to take a lot of your time because I wasn't a central speaker, but those are the points I wanted to highlight. Thank you very much, Dr. Rutere.